All right, so welcome back, everyone. I think we can slowly get started as more people come into the meeting from the waiting room. If you are just joining us, my name is Lynn Ransom. I am an organizer of the 13th Annual Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age. And we are now having our afternoon panel, which is a discussion panel. And I think the plan is to introduce the three panelists. I'll introduce each of them right now, and then we'll let them give their responses. And when they're done with their responses, we will open the floor up to questions. And these are questions for the panelists. They can also be questions related to the theme of the day for the speakers who presented this morning. And also I want to save some time for any questions for those who submitted videos that were running during the break between the morning session and the afternoon session. All right, so without further ado, I'll begin. Our first panelist is Whitney Dratin. She's an assistant professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, specializing in the history of the book and other text technologies from print to digital. In addition to her forthcoming book, Cut, Copy, and Paste, which is being staged on the Manifold Scholarship platform through University of Minnesota Press, and I understand that to mean that the text will be published, but then on the platform there will be access to other sort of offshoots of her text, more sort of digital technical accompaniments to the text. She's also published on textile metaphors and the poetry of Isabella Whitney, print on demand publishing, and Milton's Areopagitica. I am not able to pronounce foreign words today, and the digital humanities. And she has also co-edited Provoke, a web-based collection of sonic scholarship. A print companion, Digital Sound Studies, is forthcoming from Duke University Press. So please welcome Whitney. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lynn, and thanks for inviting me. I'm a bit of an interloper here, although always happily so. As Lynn mentioned, a lot of my work deals with the early modern period, although I teach book history from cuneiform to HTML, and also work a lot with digital humanities and digital book history, as I've kind of just been calling it, along with some others. And my own recent work deals with cutting and pasting fragmented text in the 17th century. So to kind of borrow a meme that's going around Twitter, I'm not a medievalist, but I kind of seem like one sometimes. And so I always seem to end up at the Sim Symposium or hanging out with these kind folks, and I'm always thrilled to do so. But I say all that to preface my brief remarks, just so you know where I'm coming from. And I think I've actually maybe learned more than I think I can offer here. So my plan for brief discussion was just to summarize the three papers that we heard, just because we've had a little bit of a break, to remind us with some comments, and then ask two questions that we might take up in the discussion. And since we have a large audience of diverse people, I would also welcome comments, and doesn't have to be a Q&A from my particular perspective. It would be really interesting to hear how other people have been reflecting on these papers too. That's maybe one of the benefits we can have here with such a large group. So to begin, Peter Stokes' paper asked us, how can AI, like deep learning, be used to advance paleographic tasks like the recognition of certain scripts across a corpus, or identifying with some degree of certainty the same scribe across manuscripts? And the standout idea for me here was his proposal that deep fakes of our own manuscripts might be used to train a model for transcription. And the value here, of course, is in saving labor. One will already know the transcription of a manufactured fake version of a manuscript, then making it easier to train the model. But of course, there might be some slight value added with accuracy as well. I think it was maybe Mike Toth during the Q&A brought up this question of how do we deal with and protect against the circulation of deep fakes. This might be an interesting question for us to return to a little bit more. He cited the example of the supposed Dead Sea Scroll fragments at the Museum of the Bible. Of course, forgeries have been around for a very long time. Facsimiles are often mistaken for the real thing. In my own field, with early modern printing, one still finds type facsimiles from the 19th century being presented as, for instance, a 16th century book in catalogs. But I think this problem is radically compounded by precisely the fact that so much of our research is online now and can spin out of, like, something like a deep fake text can spin out of our handling and control. The second paper, Alberto Campagnola, offered a useful state of the field when it comes to thinking about what digitization is and does to the materiality of books. As he showed us, spines and other parts of books are increasingly part of a digitization process, but we also have available more advanced forms of imaging like micro-CT scans, multispectral imaging. We might add to that hyperspectral imaging of various sorts. And there's a nice point of overlap here that will be familiar to many in the audience, I'm sure, between Peter and Alberto's papers, and that's in some of the efforts to combine machine learning and advanced imaging. I'm thinking of the work of computer scientist Brent Seal's team at the University of Kentucky. This is the team that first imaged and extracted text from the Engedi scroll, a charred scroll that couldn't be physically unrolled. They virtually reconstructed it in 3D, unrolled it virtually, and were able to read the text. Now, when they tried to use similar imaging techniques on the Herculaneum scrolls, a kind of second project that also was widely taken up in the popular press, they found that the text was not written in a metal-based ink, and so three-dimensional imaging didn't actually work for extracting the text. And so they're training an AI to notice subtle differences in the X-ray scans, like a change in the fiber of the underlying papyrus. And the goal of doing so is to hopefully isolate the inked spots from the uninked spots. So an interesting point of overlap between the first two papers. We often talk about digitization as lossy. And in other words, what do we lose when we digitize? But I think this is one area where digitization and digital technologies are making visible aspects of a manuscript's materiality that otherwise would have remained invisible to us through physical handling. And I think Alberto's paper reminds us that digitization is actually not lossy, but one more link in a long chain of a manuscript's remediations. And if we think about more plural ways of visualizing and capturing materiality through both imaging and metadata, we end up with much more robust records than that in fact might be used remotely to do serious codicology and paleography. And in fact, to do work that wouldn't be available to us non-remotely in a physical setting. I guess you could do it non-remotely, but in a physical setting, I should say. Finally, Sarah Bowen-Savant's paper introduced us to some of the findings coming out of the amazing Kitab project, a large corpus of Arabic texts from roughly the 8th through the 15th century, comprised of an astonishing 1.7 billion words. And in particular, Sarah drew our attention to ways that we might automate the mapping of reuse across a corpus this large. And not just brute reuse, not just the copying of one text into another, but how people thought of themselves as reusing texts. And this was a distinction that Sarah mentioned somewhat briefly, but I thought was actually really important and intriguing because it's not something I've heard about in people trying to map reuse of texts. And that's this idea that how people imagined themselves as reusing and then how they annotated those citations, how they marked those citations is as mappable and as interesting. And that seems to me a second order of interpretation that can be done with this kind of technical task. So for instance, Sarah showed us how it's possible to graph isnads or long strings of citations in texts over time, with writers in certain centuries turning to this device more commonly than others. And I was really taken by that graph that she showed of one century, many manuscripts have these isnads in them, and then want to ask, well, what can we do with these kinds of graphs? What can we do with this incredible data not possible outside of the digital technologies? So briefly, then I'll turn to two questions that I would like to open up for discussion. One, and that came out of listening to these papers this morning along with you. And one question is, how do we deal with the fragment-whole relationship? And by deal with, I mean, both how might we need to update cataloging practices to accommodate both descriptive metadata about a book, but also those many remediated fragments of that book within an entry. So for instance, bibliophily is incorporating viscol when possible. The Schoenberg database has done some of this work. I'm pumping up SIMS here intentionally because I think a lot of this work is coming out of SIMS right now. But I also want to kind of ask, can we extrapolate from some of the intellectual and theoretical work that's being done behind the design of these databases to make more generalizable principles that are useful in other projects and catalogs? And related to this actually came up in the Q&A a little bit, but I think it's worth more discussion. Related to this, how can the many fragmented and dispersed databases, many of them which are scholar-led or collaboratively led by a group of scholars across different fields, how can we take these dispersed databases and projects and start to link them together to produce a bigger picture? This has been a question in digital humanities for decades now. I think we're on the cusp of starting to think more seriously about it. Obviously, we have linked data. Obviously, we try to make our work interoperable, but I mean more tangibly, what would an infrastructure for shared manuscript studies across periods and places look like? And this seems necessary to think about, even if speculatively, for any kind of global, cross-cultural, or trans-historical work. And this brings me to my second point, which is that it would be necessary for work across media too. And the second question I wanted to bring up here is, how do we deal with the relationship between the general and the specific? Or to put it differently, how can we begin to build network data and collaborative data building initiatives across different periods with shared media? I'm aware that we're in a situation where we're talking mostly about the medieval period and about manuscripts. But all of these projects, it strikes me as someone from slightly outside and adjacent to that period, all of these projects are incredibly robustly useful across different periods. For instance, there are initiatives in the early modern period to begin tracking binding waste in early printed books, but those doing so are primarily interested in the relationship between the waste and the printed text. But in fact, that project might be just as interesting to Fragmentarium, to fragmentologists, or to medievalists more generally. And similarly, of course, manuscript doesn't end after the invention of print, continues to be a primary way of publishing certain kinds of texts well into the 18th century. We all know this, and beyond in Europe. And reuse doesn't end either. In fact, Sarah's work had so much resonance with me for thinking about Ryan Cordell's work, a digital humanist who works in the 19th century on the copying of newspaper texts, fragments within newspapers, little snippets of text within newspapers copied across American newspapers in the 19th century. And of course, I'm thinking about its applicability to my own work on how fragments of printed texts are being reused and copied physically in 17th century books, which exist in a hybrid state kind of between print and what we think of as manuscript. So how can we connect up these pieces of work in ways that retain the specificity of the work that's being done by a project like Kitab, while also looking towards tools and methods and practices that are reusable, pun intended, across and between different periods? And I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to having more discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Whitney. And I realized as soon as Whitney started talking that I did not do what I said I was going to do and introduce everybody. So I'll just go ahead and introduce one speaker at a time and then let them speak. So our next speaker is Lisa Fagin Davis. Lisa is Professor of Practice in Manuscript Studies at the Simmons Graduate School of Library Information Science and Executive Director of the Medieval Academy of America, which is, I think, many of us know her. She is the author of several publications, including La Chronique Anonyme Universelle, Reading and Writing History in the 15th Century France, which was published in 2015. And many of you have been on the virtual conference, who have been on the virtual conference and seminar circuit since March, will likely have seen her speaking about and advocating for her most recent research focus, that is fragmentology in a digital environment. So I'm sure she'll have a lot to say about that. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Whitney, for your comments. That's a really helpful framing of the three papers we all heard this morning. And thank you, Lynn, for inviting me and to the whole SIMS team. I've been a cheerleader for the Schoenberg Institute since the beginning, so I'm really, really pleased to be part of the 13th symposium. So my my perspective on all of this as a medievalist, as a digital humanist, as a fragmentologist, and so on, is I've always thought of medievalists as being early adopters of technologies. And that's who we've always been, right? From Father Busa at IBM through Digital Scriptorium in the 90s through today, where we're always on the cutting edge. We're always asking a question and thinking about how we can incorporate technology, how we can collaborate with technologists to answer these questions. And I have, you know, for me, it springs from the fact that I spent my childhood playing Dungeons and Dragons and reading Tolkien, and a lot of my friends did as well. And a lot of those friends went on to become computer scientists. And so I feel like we have, a lot of medievalists have similar origin stories. And so we have kind of fundamental, things in common with digital modes of thinking. And all of the papers that we heard this morning really show how the PIs and their teams are pushing digital medieval studies to next level. You know, teaching computers how to parse script. Can we teach it? It's a good question. Can we teach a computer to tell that a 2-compartment English A has the same semantic meaning as an A from Luxai, or even New Roman cursive for that matter? As a professor of paleography and manuscript studies, I hope we can't in the end, because I want there to always be a role for the human. But there is a role for computers and algorithms to do some of the fundamental first stage work, freeing up the humans to do more analytical, judgment-based work. In Alberto's talk, we see sort of a similar pushing of boundaries, where he's talking about how to engage digitally with manuscripts in a way that's more than just the text on the page, which is of course where digitization started, right? We're just interested in what's written on the page. They're interested in the text and the illustrations. But now there's a whole movement to really think about materiality and physicality and the object, the book as an object out there in space and its journey through time, right? So it is kind of a 4-dimensional object that it has, and this is the role of the Schoenberg database, is to think about the journeys of a codex through time and different human interactions with that codex as it makes its way. And so digitization has had to adapt as we've seen a growing need to engage with the 3-dimensional object. And so in addition to spinning 3-dimensional objects on a 2-dimensional screen, we're seeing these other ways of seeing beyond what the human eye can see. So we're looking at X-ray, we're looking at CAT scan, we're looking at multispectral imagery all up and down the spectrum. We're looking at X-ray fluorescence, all these different ways of seeing beyond what the human eye can see. So this is another way in which the digital device helps humans to go beyond what we can do, beyond the limits of our brains and our bodies and our hands and our eyes. And then finally, Sarah's paper I found so fascinating, because this is exactly such a perfect example of how we can make the computer do the grunt work, right? Imagine trying to do what that project does manually. If you've ever done a manual collation of 30 manuscripts, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I did that for my book. It took me 10 years. It is a nightmare of a project, and it requires so much organization, and it can't be done. The human brain cannot do that kind of work at that kind of scale. And so by training the digital device, whatever that is, whether it's an algorithm or a camera or whatever that device is that is engaging with an algorithm, that allows us to do more than we could do on our own. And that is where a digital project needs to start. You don't just want to, the best kind of digital work isn't, let's do this because it's cool. That's not the reason to do it. The reason to do it is because it allows you to do something that you cannot do otherwise, that it's an extension of our humanity and allows us to push ourselves and to push the work further than we were able to do a generation ago. So if we, and so that's the real takeaway for me, is that AI and these computerized algorithms and cameras and whatever kind of automated analytics we're doing allows us to go beyond ourselves and to be, to engage with our work in a way that would truly not have been possible 20 years ago. And I got my doctorate 30 years ago. I did a fragmentology project in an analog way. And so I'm kind of at that bridging between when we were doing work in a totally analog fashion, because it was the only option, and now doing that work digitally. So you can really, those of us who are of this generation, we can really see how the difference between the work we were able to do when we were starting out and the work that we're able to do now. And it's very exciting, as you can probably tell from my enthusiasm. And in specific responses, so in sort of thinking about digital modes of scholarship, Alberto, who was it? Patrick Perkins asked Alberto if it's possible to cite a digital object as a primary source. And I think you can, because in certain circumstances, right? Because the digital object is not the same as the manuscript object. So depending on the kind of work that you're doing, the digital object has its own existence. It has its own date of creation. It has metadata associated with it, not just the metadata attached to the object, but its own digital metadata, what resolution it was taken, how the color was, how the color was done, what exposure, and so on. Those kind of fields that are specific to the digital object and could be different from a digitization of the object that was done 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So there are places where, depending on the kind of work that you're doing, the digital object as a separate entity that has its own existence is something that you want to cite. And of course, if you are working from the digital object, you definitely need to cite the persistent URL of that object when you are citing, if you're citing, the LJS 220, manuscript 266, folio 72R. If you have not actually seen the object in person and you're citing it based on digital images, you definitely need to cite the digital object as well, because that's your source. In response to Suze Paul, who asked, how much is it the responsibility of the institution that holds the object to hold or gather or preserve the pieces of that object that may be fragmented? You know how I feel about this. Fragmentarium is my go-to for that kind of work, and Fragmentarium is specifically designed to take advantage of IIIF functionality and IIIF sequencing to bring those images together from different collections, especially if the collections if their repositories are in fact using IIIF as well. You can then mirror those sequences into the shared canvas at Fragmentarium, which really takes advantage of IIIF functionality in the best way. And so you have each of those sequences from different collections with some metadata attached, And then you can use Fragmentarium to put those sequences in order, and then you create a new sequence made up of all the constituent sequences. So you actually have, you're not disrupting the original canvas, the original leaf in its home repository. I would very much, and I mentioned this in the chat, I think it would be, and I don't know if anyone from Fragmentarium is here today, but it would be really cool if we could somehow incorporate VisCol with Fragmentarium reconstructions of fragmented manuscripts. And I know that that's been done already in Bibliophily, that you can actually see the VisCol quire structures with the manuscripts. And that is just amazing. It's such a fantastic way to engage with these digital objects. And it would be very cool if we could do that with Fragmentarium. And then the last thing I would say is that the theme of the conference here, it has to do with lockdown, right? With COVID, what COVID has done to us all. And it has really both expanded and limited our work and opportunities. Peter Stokes asked, does digitization equal democratization? And during COVID, it absolutely does, right? Because it applies to the digitization and the virtualization of symposia like this, not just about the resources, but about gatherings like this, that so many people are able to attend from all over the world who wouldn't be able to travel to Philadelphia. And as much as those of us who are within flying distance of Philadelphia would love to all be together, have coffee, go out for drinks afterwards, stay up late talking, it really is a much more, there's a real equity question about virtual conferences and meeting in virtual spaces, in that it's better for the planet, saves everyone money, and more people can attend. I don't think, I'm getting a little off topic, I don't think that live conferencing is going to go away, but I think one thing that we've all learned during these last few months is that we can do this. I mean, there was a real pushback against the idea of virtual conferencing initially, as everyone said, we have to meet in person, we have to be together. And it's true, we want to be together, we want to be in person, but we can do this. And there are ways to leverage the virtuality of this kind of format to really take advantage of it, rather than just thinking of it as a compromise and taking a conference and making it into an online event, but actually as Sims has done here with these flash session videos, that really takes advantage of this, the concept of a virtual space in, I think, a really fantastic and engaging way. And if you didn't get to see the flash session videos, I really recommend that you do. And in addition, we also now all have, we have so much access, as Peter pointed out, to digital reproductions of manuscripts and digital resources and databases. And because we can't go to the library, it's a real equalizer in that we all have the same access. It's people who, we're lucky enough to be able to go to the Bodleian every day. You can't do that now, which is unfortunate, right? But it means that everyone is kind of at a level playing field in a way. On the other hand, all the digital labs are shut down. We're not getting any new digital material coming out right now. And so we're all eager, I think the digital imagists are ready to get back to work when it's safe to do so. And we are all ready to see new digitizations hit the internet. Sorry to Mike Toth, who he and I have something cooking, and we won't be able to do it this year. Maybe next year with Ben Albritton. What I found interesting though, and I reached out to a bunch of repositories early in the summer just to ask for some usage statistics during lockdown. And what I found was that most of the repositories who reported data to me reported a big spike, a big uptick in hits since lockdown began, compared to the same time period in 2019. It's not a big surprise, right? We have no choice. So we have to engage digitally. But what was really interesting was that there was a big uptick, but that uptick was only in the spring, in March and April. And then there was a huge fall off through the summer. And I think we're all just tired, right? We're all just tired of this. We love each other. We love being able to see each other when we can like this, but we just want it to be over. And I think that's partly, I think that kind of digital fatigue explains in part the drop off in usage that we saw in the summer. You know, we all spent those first few months manuscript surfing at our favorite repositories, sitting on the couch in our pajamas. But if you also, you know, it's hard to stay motivated. And yet we're also seeing this incredible creativity. If you look at these videos that were posted, we're seeing just amazing creativity from all of these PIs who are doing these incredible projects while in lockdown, that they're able to do this work. And that's the real miracle of it. If this had happened, you know, 20, 25 years ago, we would have been stuck. There would have been nothing we could do. But now we can do this digital work, even though we are not able to go to the library. And so just finally, I interpret the session theme of looking back, aiming forward, as looking back to a pre-COVID world, if we can remember back that far past February, and aiming forward as looking towards the post-COVID world, hopefully just a year from now. And I really, really hope that next November, we'll see us gathering for the 14th Schoenberg Symposium in person in the Kislak Center on the 6th floor of the library. And I really, really hope to see you all then, if not before. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa, and I hope so too. I miss seeing everybody. All right, our final panelist for today is Doug Emery. Doug heads the Cultural Heritage Computing Group for Penn Libraries, Technology and Digital Initiatives Division. Since he came to Penn in 2013, Doug led the technical development of Open, which is Penn Library's repository for manuscript data. He's led the VisCall implementation and was a technical consultant on the Schoenberg database of manuscripts during our redevelopment period. I should say he led in partnership with Dot Porter and Alberto Campagnola the VisCall implementation. Prior to his arrival, he was the digital architect of the Archimedes Palimpsest project and for the digitization of the Palimpsest manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai. So please welcome Doug. Thank you and take it away.
Thanks, Lynn. So as Lynn was saying, I head of a group that we call Cultural Heritage Computing here at Penn Libraries, and essentially we do much of the digital work for the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies and for the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. This includes building websites, essentially the web face, the public web face of SIMS and the Kislak Center. A lot of that work falls to our group, as well as access and preservation through Penn's digital repository and through the open website, where we publish the digital manuscript resource, digitized manuscripts of nearly 50 repositories at present, and that number is growing. And then also working on digital humanities projects, VisCall, as Lynn mentioned, the Schoenberg database of manuscripts, a project that's now coming into the libraries, being led by Nick Herman and Barbara Ellerson Williams. The Basira project, Books as Symbols in Renaissance Art, which is on images of, as it says, images of books in Renaissance painting and sculpture and other kinds of artwork. And then also on the Mapping Manuscript Migration project, which is a transatlantic platform project between institutions in the US and in Europe to bring together, using linked data, different collections of manuscript metadata in order to track them over time. The And so when COVID became a reality, and back in March, and we were sent away for the library, and at that time I thought for about 2 weeks until we would be back. We actually, my group made a physical transition from the library to our homes, but the work that we ended up doing was largely the same. And as Lisa's pointing out, while it's the same, it's also it's very different. And that is, this just the fact of being in front of a screen all of the time. But again, the work is the same, and so and in some cases we actually have more work to do, which puts us in this interesting place of being taxed, but also being glad that we're among those who have something that we do have work that we can do. And so we've adjusted to a new way of working as well as you can. And as a part of this, the work that we've done has become, while it's the same for us, I think we're aware of the fact that it is more central to what everyone is doing. One of the first projects that we worked on was creating a list of the digital projects of SIMS, a COVID resources website that we published on GitHub Pages, which was a kind of quick list of tools that the Kislak Center and the SIMS had produced that people could use to do work when they were in lockdown. And it's also led us to think about what the projects mean and how meaningful they are. And it is a fact that, as Lisa is saying, what digital humanities allows you to do is to do old things, the things that you used to be able to do, you should be able to do them faster very often. And then it also makes it possible for you to ask questions that you couldn't ask before. And so and so when I listen to the talks that we heard today, as someone who works as a programmer and works with programmers and digital specialists, the question that I have is, well, what does this mean for the work that we do? What can we be doing? And what directions can we move in? And so listening to, so I'm just gonna make some general observations, and this will repeat some of the things that we've already heard. But I think that there are points these are the points that really struck me. First, listening to Peter Stokes's and Sarah Savant's papers, I was struck by again and again the value of open access to data. This is both computational access to data as well as the right to be able to use the data once you have it. I think that open licensing is in this space is just as important as being able to get to the data through computational tools, because without that, you're really limited to what you can do. And so on the open website, one of the things that we stress is that you can, with this information, you can do anything you like with it. You don't have to ask permission. And this is one of the great things that's happened over the past several years, not just the availability of the tools, but the attitudes that allows institutions to make this material available. But also important is the metadata that allows you to, that's paired with digital images, that allows you to be able to work with it in a way, to do computational work with it, and the presentation of the material in such a way that it's available for interoperability. And IIIF, of course, is a huge part of that interoperable environment that we work in now, both through its image API as well as its presentation API, which allows discoverability. And I just echo again what Lisa was saying about democratization. The fact is that making this data available is making it available to reading communities that otherwise wouldn't be able to access these materials at all. And thinking in terms, and Sarah Savant echoed this in her idea of a Kindle reader that would allow users to be able to read these Arabic historical texts. One of the things that seems to me that's not lost in, at least in some fashion, in all of the talks that we heard, is the connection of the digital materials to the physical object and the products of human creativity, whether it's through handwriting and printed texts that are accessed through OCR and handwritten text recognition, but also through the structure of books that is either revealed through advanced imaging techniques or even ordinary imaging, as well as through modeling that allows us to describe the structure of books in computational and graphical fashion. Another topic that strikes me is one of precision. On the one hand, they're the approximation and the guesses of artificial intelligence, and the judgments of which we very often don't fully understand and aren't sure how to interpret, versus the precision of XML and linked data models that allow for precise computation of metadata descriptions of physical objects and other types of information. Even when the models themselves represent taxonomies, and the taxonomies are schematized representations of the things that they represent, right? So when this is a point that I've tried to make in a number of instances, a number of cases, a number of times, and I don't know how well I've made it, but essentially whenever you create a model, you're creating a kind of metaphor that describes something that exists in the real world. And that metaphor itself is always going to be imprecise to some extent. And so when we're dealing with digital materials in different ways, we're dealing with different kinds of approximations and compromises. And that leads to my next point, which is that there's this question of understanding of the materials and the tools that we're using, and understanding the validity of the answers that we receive from them. So tools can carry out complex tasks, but as we ask new questions, we need to understand the methods, the models, and their limitations. And this topic came up again and again when we were talking about the way AI interprets and reads text. How is it that we understand what the AI is understanding? How is it that we understand the results that we're getting? Recently, Lynn Ransom and others who were on this call, we worked on the Mapping Manuscript Migration project, in which we brought together the data sets from three different institutions, from the University of Pennsylvania Library, from the Oxford Bodleian Library Catalog of Medieval Manuscripts, and from the IRHT's Bibal project, into a single linked data model in which we ask questions about into a single linked data model and linked data set in which we ask questions about the transmission of manuscripts. And we ask questions like, well, how many manuscripts were written by this author that were available in Europe at this time? And the fact of the matter is given the data set that we had, you couldn't ask that question, because the data set itself didn't actually represent the entirety of all of the manuscripts that were in Europe at any given time, or that are in Europe now. It represents a certain small set. And so one of the things that became vital as a part of that project is understanding, all right, what is the data that we have, and what does it actually represent? And whether we're looking at, whether you're looking at the results of textual comparison, or OCR or HTR, it's important to understand what it is that the data can actually really tell you. And then finally, there's this question of primary resources, and whether or not images can be a primary resource. And I think that the answer is that sometimes they are, and it is a matter of perspective in how the information is being used, because I think it is the case that images are a primary resource for the paleographical work that Peter Stokes is doing, and for the work of Kitab. And this brings me to an observation that Kelly Tuttle, who's a member of SIMS and is with us today, has made several times, is that, as Lisa has said, we are using images as primary resources. And there's a question of whether or not we've actually come to confront what that means. Will Knoll has observed that, as Lisa points out, that images are not manuscripts, but neither are manuscripts the digital images. Each of them has its own value and answers questions that the other cannot. And we have ways to cite books and manuscripts, but we very often gloss over the connection of the image to the book. And we need, and this is something that, that as Lisa points out, we need to be aware of. We need to know where the images come from. We need to know that the image that we're looking at now is, at this moment, is the same as the original image that was taken by the folks who were who did the camera capture. And I believe that's all I have for now. Thank you very much. I'll open it up to discussion.
Thank you all three. I'm tempted to spend 15 minutes myself asking you questions in response to your responses, but I will not do that and open the floor to people who have come here to ask the questions themselves.
Yes, so I don't see any questions yet in the chat. If anyone in the general audience does have questions, please add them to the chat. And the way that we did it in the first session is I will call on you and you can unmute and ask your own question and have a chance to discuss. But since there aren't any questions, since this was a panel discussion that was in response to the talks earlier, I wanted to open it up for you three to ask each other questions. And if Alberto or Sarah or who was the third person this morning?
Peter,
if you guys are here and you also have things to say, drop them in the chat. So I'm gonna just let you guys chat and we'll see how that goes.
So I had one comment. I'm sorry, Whitney, were you about to say something? Oh, okay. So Doug brought up the mapping manuscript migrations project, and I meant to bring that up as well in response to something Whitney said at the end of her remarks about the question of taking all these different disparate collections of data and figuring out how we can bring them together and cross-search them. And I think as the MMM project demonstrated, it can be done, but it's really hard. It's really, really hard because so many of these data models developed independently of one another. And they're asking different questions and they're modeling their data and formatting it in different ways. They're naming their fields different ways and so you have to first do the really hard work of figuring out how do you connect this field in that database with this field in that database. And that's something actually that Biblissima has done also in a really, really successful way. And if you aren't familiar with Biblissima, I really recommend it. It's an incredible cross-platform search for manuscripts, digitized manuscripts. And it has managed to do that, I think, in a really successful way. And it's one of the things, we're in the middle now, and Lynn is spearheading this project to redesign the digital scriptorium data model. And that's one of the questions thinking about too, is can digital scriptorium somehow serve as a cross-platform search of repositories in the United States? And discovering that that's a hard question to answer, again, because even though so many collections are using their OPAC, their library catalog system with MARC records, but everyone does it in a different way. And that, again, makes that cross-platform searching really challenging. And I do agree with you, Whitney. I think that's kind of the next frontier, is figuring out how to take all this data and how to bring it all together in an effective way.
Part of what I wonder with this question also is like, who is responsible for that, right? Because of the natural siloing of institutions and projects, right? I mean, who will take up that task is behind that question as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of the more that the richer your data, the more difficult it is to bring the data together. And one of I'm participating in the Digital Scriptorium 2.0 meeting, where we're talking about how it is we create a data set that would allow us to look across all the manuscripts in the US. And the place where we start is we want to find the least amount of information that we think that we can get that will work, that we can map across all of these data sets. Because the more detail you have, the more it's going to start to fray at the edges. And then it's also a question of, as you know, who's going to, as Whitney's saying, who's going to do the work? I mean, the more you make it like work, the less likely you are to succeed. And especially when you look at, okay, sure, Penn can do it, perhaps Yale can do it, and they'll put somebody on it. They'll get all the data ready so that it could be a digital scriptorium. But what happens to all of the smaller institutions, or even large institutions that have 3 or 4 manuscripts and they don't have someone to do that work? So the thing that's interesting to me is that there's not only is it a question of data and what are the technologies that you use, but what's also the human model that you use to make sure that these things happen.
Well, and the idea of a simple data model is such a sea change from where we were 20, 25 years ago, when you were trying to get as much data as possible into that record, right? Like Digital Scriptorium is a great example of this. The original data model for Digital Scriptorium, which was totally innovative and mind-blowing when it was developed 25 years ago, the idea was to take a long format bibliographical description of a medieval manuscript and create a record that had a place for all of that incredibly detailed information that we want to see in a long form bibliographic description. But I think what we've all learned in the last 25 years is that what you really want is the minimal, the most streamlined, the smallest record that can be that can still provide discoverability. And then you can always link to a PDF of that long form description if you have it. You don't want to lose that information, but you don't necessarily have to put that in a discoverable database. And that's just a complete turnaround in terms of thinking about kind of data theory, and especially as it applies to medieval manuscripts. I find that really fascinating. And it's taken me a while to kind of wrap my head around that. I'm totally there now. But again, because of I came up in that generation where we were developing these really complicated data models to kind of realize that what you really want is a smaller, streamlined data model that really enables, but that can still enable rich discoverability. And that's, of course, where linked data comes in too, right? If you're using BIAP and authorities, that really enables that kind of rich discoverability.
So while you guys have been talking, there's a couple of comments in the chat. Sarah Savant has a comment. Sarah, do you want to unmute? And
I mean, it's a bit above my pay grade, to be honest, but I mean, having been in Europe and seen, et cetera, there's quite a lot of discussion about how to create, and this isn't led, I mean, it's led across disciplines, you know, large groups of disciplines, trying to think about kind of a total research data pipeline that doesn't start, let's say, that the data isn't codified at the end. You know, it's iterative at every process, at every step, and it's part of the notion of fair data. But the idea of large kind of portals that you can work within, I think, is the next trend, you know, that are funded by the EU. Zenodo will play a major role as being able to store data, I think, make it open.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I think, I don't know, I've been thinking about hitching my project up to one of these, you know, at some point, you know, when the next generation comes out and is ready. But I mean, we're building from the very beginning. And we've just got so much data, you know, it feels, although when you talk to anyone who works in a bank, they laugh. But, you know, it feels us like so much data. So we don't have the luxury, and we also don't, I think, you know, the Bodleian is not going to solve anything for us, right? Our manuscript data, for example, is dispersed, you know, across places that don't have open access policies, et cetera. So we're not going to get the data, you know, from Istanbul in the way we would like to, for example, you know, and we just won't, or Syria or Egypt, et cetera. So, yeah, so I think we're dealing with a very different situation in some ways to what you're talking about. But I think the common problem of how do you set yourself up, you know, and I think you said very well, Lisa, that things have changed very much, you know, that we've tried to be quite lightweight. And for example, we have, you know, we have all these books and there's no geographical metadata on them. And we need that. And so what is the strategy? And, you know, I sat down with, you know, the annotator, and he laid out a plan that was going to take 3 hours to do every single author. And I was like, that's not going to work. We can't do that. Afford it. Even, you know, even with really generous funding from the EU. So we've, you know, we're going to have to be, you know, not all that other stuff anyone put in, you know, just this basic information.
The work's never going to get done if we try and do everything.
No, we're going to do 750 works in their geographical origins, but we cannot do 7,000. I mean, it's
You have to, there are hard choices that you have to make about what kind of weight you're willing to you know.
Yeah, because if you do this, you're not doing that.
Throw over the side, to push the metaphor a little bit.
But that issue of quality versus quantity is a real issue. I mean, for any project, no matter what the size. And it's quite hard, I think, when you're a new PI to try to figure out how to navigate those issues, because you're well aware that you're always, you know, there's never quite a right answer. And the best you can do is, you know, we steer towards some quantity, but we're heading to quality now.
Yeah, I mean, we all want all the data, right? We want all the data.
Yeah, exactly.
We want all the manuscripts, we want them all imaged, and we want full, complete, thorough metadata right now. But we can't do that, right?
And Doug's point about survival bias, although I know that's not the term you use, but that's a real issue. And, you know, what are the length of the conclusions you can make out of your data is a very serious issue for anyone working as we all do. And the minute you start to limit, you've left some of the battle undone, you know, but.
You know, there are these questions about curation versus lightweight versus data quality and sustainability. You know, in thinking about sort of these sort of like large centralized, and I'm look briefly at Peter's comment about centralized projects, and you know, like that. While you can, how sustainable is that? How much money goes into that, and how do you keep funding those? And one of the things that one of the approaches that we end up taking in the U.S., I think, as kind of by default, and we're used to it, is we go in, we get something done, and then we move on, and we leave little pieces of data around that end up being useful, and we know how to use them, but you're not constantly curating. And you can also, if you're really doing a lot of deep curation, then, and a lot of you know, detailed cataloging, then you have to sustain that, and it's a great deal of work. And so, and that also goes to this question of like, how good do you need your data to be? How happy are you with dirty data? You, and as Peter Stokes was saying, when you get 80% right, you can actually answer a lot of questions with 80% accuracy.
And let me clarify in response to what Peter Stokes just wrote. He writes, do we really want all the data? Of course we don't. I wasn't being precise enough in my terminology. I shouldn't have said we want all the data. But ideally, what I would love to see is a full bibliographic description of every manuscript in the world, right? I mean, that would be lovely, but we can't have that. And so we do need this in order to be able to streamline what we're doing in a sort of live and light way. You do need the simplification of newer data models. I agree, absolutely.
And just quickly to that point, I mean, I think part of why this conversation interests me is because of the future possibilities. Like, we can't do it all now, but there is some future where if we think enough and put the steps in place now, there can be more, for instance, global work, despite the kind of, you know, little pockets that Doug is describing that most digital humanities or digital database projects fall into right now. On kind of on this note, although a little bit adjacent, we had an interesting visitor in our digital humanities lab here at Penn last week, Eileen Caliscan, and she's a computer scientist, and she basically said, we are so desperate for historical data sets in order to, she studies algorithmic bias in AI, and she said, we just desperately want these historical data sets. And, you know, to that, I feel like that's an opportunity for us to say, well, then give us the funding and the means of doing it, right? Because that's a perfect point of collaboration where we could offer them something and vice versa.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, are we okay for time, Lynn? I
Yeah.
don't know what time.
I
Okay.
think 30.
Okay, great. So while you were chatting, Jeff
3:30.
Love.
3:30.
Sorry?
It's 3:30, not 2:30. It's
3:30, yeah. If it's 2:30, we're
yeah, we're done.
bad. Jeff Love sent a note when you were talking earlier. Sounds like the kind of thing that would fit into the agenda of SSHOC, which I took a look at. It's the Social Sciences and Humanities Open Cloud. It looks like it's a DARIA related thing. DARIA is sort of a long-standing digital project in Europe. Jeff, I don't actually know much about this at all. I don't know if you're there and you want to speak to this, or if anyone else in the group knows what this is, the Social Sciences Humanities Open Cloud.
I can pitch in briefly. I was just picking up on this conversation about who's going to do the work or who's going to investigate this topic of federating data, or I don't know, making up guidelines for minimal requirements or something like this. I mean, these kinds of things are around, at least in bits and pieces, I think. I should say that my background, I'm a digital medievalist and one of those alt-act jobs. I'm a data steward here at the Technical University in Delft. So I look at data and workflows and procedures and this sort of thing. And so I'm interested in trying to put together something like systems for, I don't know, good editions and translations of historical texts and stuff like that. So this is the kind of bread and butter that I work on. But it's not really a huge interest. There's no money in it, is the thing, as everybody here knows. But there are groups like SHOC, which is a relatively new endeavor. It's one of those groups that has a lot of EU money. They do a lot of things with a lot of people, but they work at a very generic level. But if somebody had the clout, some professor of some note were to try to get into there could be an element of, I don't know, historical cataloging or digital manuscript federation or something like that. An idea to pursue. Happy to join up with anybody who wants to do that.
So one of the issues that those of us working in the States face is it's really difficult to collaborate with anyone in the EU because of the way that funding agencies in the EU work. And sometimes in the United States, you're not allowed to be part of funding, application for funding in the EU. And that really limits the kind of cross-Atlantic collaboration. We all sort of end up working in our national silos. It would be nice if there were more ways that we could more easily collaborate with our colleagues overseas. I think that would be lovely.
The grants aren't set up very well for it. It's true. I mean, and I think to try to do it, as far as I understand now, having gone through it and not done it because it seemed impossible, the next time around I would try to do something on a subcontracting level, which is a little bit more flexible, but it's not really the right way to set up a partnership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's really unfortunate. And the truth is there's not a lot of enthusiasm for humanities funding in the United States right now. Things are, less than there used to be, I should say, but things may change in the next administration. We'll see.
Okay, I think Peter has his hand up. Peter Stokes.
Yes, so just going to come in quickly on that point to say that I'm involved in a couple of European infrastructures, and we have been looking at SHOC and others and trying to coordinate this. In practice, it is very difficult though, partly because it is very centralized, and it is, as I think Sarah said, on a science model. So they're asking us to produce the 35-year plan and this sort of thing, which is how we're supposed to do these things. Plan quite detailed budgets for what we're going to be doing in 2050 and so on. So although I think it's genuinely good intentions, but there is a little bit, I think it's fairly clear that at an EU level, it's the science discussion that is dominating, and we need
Well,
to.
and that impacts
fit into
also
that
the new models for open access publishing too, that are,
Sure.
may be requirements of funding in the EU, and in the US, publishers are not necessarily able to just make things open access. The models, the funding models, the financial models just often don't allow it, and that's been something that's been really difficult, I think, for a lot of people to figure out how to be in compliance with those regulations and still engage in the US. It's really difficult.
I have a direct message from B. Williams Ellertson, and this is a sort of related topic, and it's something that I know a lot of us are thinking about, so we might get a conversation about this. That is thinking about forward migration as technology changes. So it's not only the data that you make now and the tools that you make now, it's making sure that 20 years from now, 50 years from now, you'll still have that so technology, and then the citation of that. So are the citation references that we make now going to be still working again 20 years from now, 50 years from now? So does anyone
that's
say
so
something
important,
about that?
Thinking about how to decouple your data from the application in which your data is used. That's also something that's a real sea change in the last 25 years. That wasn't something you ever really thought about 25 years ago, and now it's best practices, right? Is you want to be able to suck your data out as a CSV file and save it forever, or do something else with it, right? I mean, Doug, you can certainly speak to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that there's even a focus. So for years at SIMS, and I think in other places too, clearly people have been thinking about the importance of data and the fact that, and this is anyone who's been in an institution doing the kind of work that doing technical work over a long period of time is aware of how old platforms become out of date and in many cases unusable, and old interfaces do. And you can, while those go by the wayside, if you have data that's accessible, then that really matters. And people really think about, thinking very carefully about the format that their data is in. And I think even more now in projects that I'm working on, there's a strong tendency to not build something unless you absolutely have to actually move your data into an existing project, an existing tool. And we've been looking on one project, we've been talking about Wikibase, which is new to me, but it's extremely exciting. The idea of having a platform that you don't have to build, that you don't have to maintain, or if you were to build something on the top of it, it could be relatively thin. And underlying that, you have the data there, as well as an infrastructure that somebody else is responsible for maintaining, that you're using with a lot of other people.
So Laura Moriale just dropped a link in to the chat of a project that she's working on, which Laura, do you want to unmute and say something about this?
Sure. I'll just, like I said, it's a little bit self-promotional, so sorry about that. But I mean, there are a lot of people who create, have these digital projects and it lives on a particular platform, and then the platform upgrades and you have to spend, 25 hours, uploading, upgrading everything. And you don't have that, or you don't have the graduate student who knew how to do it. So this is just a little model for people to document, to archive their data, right? But also there's a little narrative that explains to people what the project is. And I find that's a very important step. So many of us here are, DH folks, but there's a lot of scholars out there who don't understand what we do. And so having that component that really explains to people why you undertook the project in the first place and where your data can be, where it can live. I think that's very helpful and a way to, once again, as Lisa said, get that data away from the platform that it was originally built on. So that's all I'll say about that. Check it out.
All right, it looks like Bill Andrus has something to add. Bill, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, it's just more of a comment than a question, but I think it does deserve plenty of talk. I've been thinking about the Etruscans lately and the fact that they wrote on linen, which I would love to read a text on linen. It seems really, really cool. The bad side of it is linen doesn't last very long. So we've lost all of their literature. And we have some of their alphabet on vases and other artifacts, but we haven't even been able to solve the code of their alphabet because we don't have enough of it. And so I've been thinking more lately about what in the digital are we doing that is like putting our text on linen, and what will it take for us to avoid that certain destruction of our digital work.
It's a good thing that Chad Gospels is on parchment then.
Yes, thank heavens for parchment.
All right, I think Lynn has a question.
Yeah, I do have a question, and this is for everybody, anybody really, but it's based on something that Whitney said. One of her questions was how can we extrapolate, and I guess we meaning scholars perhaps, or maybe all of us, the digital work that we do, how do we get to the intellectual and theoretical work behind it, if I'm understanding your question correctly? I think this is a really important thing to think about, because I think if we're looking back, I think there's been this big divide between the people who make the digital projects and the people who use the digital projects. And I think that divide is shrinking, but I think it needs to shrink more because, like in thinking about the digital Scriptorium project, and, in my head, I'm always having a defense against the people who want to have more data. And it's often in my head, in my imagination, the people who don't understand how the data is going to work, in all the ways that Doug said. And in the Mapping Manuscript Migrations project, as well as also in the redevelopment of the Schoenberg database, for me, who, I was a user before I was ever a doer, and I don't even think I can call myself a producer anymore, or ever call myself a producer. Thinking about the data modeling and how that data works, and Doug said it creates a metaphor. For me, it also created an intellectual discipline to approach the data, as well as a behavioral discipline about approaching data that I had never really considered as just a user coming to an interface, and thinking about what was behind the interface and how it was structured has really completely changed the way I think about anything, whether it's digital research or even traditional research. So I wondered if you guys could, maybe starting with Whitney, comment a little bit further about that thought about how we get the intellectual and theoretical work that goes into producing these projects out to where the users can see it and understand it.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's really interesting. I mean, this is exactly the reason why when I teach, I always have students do data audits of projects. I mean, I think we've done it with the Schoenberg database, where you look at how things have been structured and try to look for a history of a project, documentation about that intellectual labor and the theoretical work that's gone into it, and see what's there and what isn't. And often that isn't there as part of this. I think it was Laura who brought up the DDP, this idea of documenting your work. So yeah, I mean, having that as part of the documentation, and also just, I mean, I'm coming at this as someone who's primarily teaching this stuff right now, as opposed to a maker or doer also right now. So, how we teach this stuff, it shouldn't be just digital humanities versus everything else. I mean, it should be baked into anyone who's learning medieval studies, should at the graduate level, should be learning how this stuff is constructed and the intellectual labor behind it, because that's going to be the future of how they do their own work and research as well. So, I mean, that's looking down the line, but I'm starting to see that blend happen more and more. So I think we're in a good spot with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. The disconnect that you sometimes saw and sometimes still do see between the user community and the people creating the data, right? Then that's sort of what you're talking about, Lynn, that there is this, you know, you hear from users, and I think you experienced this with the Schoenberg database before the redesign, that you would hear from users saying, well, I don't understand what this is. What's the point of this data? How does it work? Why is this the manuscript or isn't this the manuscript, right? And now I think as part of the redesign, you really did that hard work of thinking about what this data set actually is, as opposed to what it was thought to be or what it might have once been. But what is it actually, and how can we explain that to the user community? And I think you've been really effective at that. I think the redesign of the Schoenberg database is a real role model for thinking about, you know, at a certain point, you have to sit back and look at your data and you have to go, so what actually is this data? What is it actually, and what can it actually do, as opposed to what do I wish it could do, or what would it do if I had all the time and money in the world, right? You know, I mean, data is, it's not ever going to be complete. It's not ever going to be perfect. Something is always better than nothing. That's my principle.
And one of the things that was helpful to me is when people say, well, why don't you have images, or why don't you do this, or why don't you do that? Because we have this discipline that's built into the data model, and I understand what that discipline is. I can say, well, no, we
right, because you know
for this
what
reason.
the database is.
And what it can and can't do, right?
Yeah,
like what its limitations are. And I think that's something that everyone has to, you know, understand, is that data has limits. Like, you know, you want all the data, but when you have all the data, you got a big fat mess that you have to sort of parse out. Yeah. So, you know, it's just like, you know, trying to get people to understand a little bit more about, you know, as we aim forward, you know, how these things are built, and what are the reasons, what are the ontologies behind them, what are the philosophies behind them.
Yeah, it's like a vision statement. It's like having a vision statement for an organization, right? You know, you spend all this time, you know, we did this with the Medieval Academy, we did all this thinking and digging and soul searching, and we came up with a vision statement that's now on our website. And the idea, once you have that kind of intellectual summary of who you are, you can then make sure that everything you do is in keeping with that. And that's exactly what you've done with the Schoenberg database. And that's what that's where we're headed with the digital Scriptorium redesign too, is I think a better understanding of what the purpose of this data set is. And once you think that through, you can then start to build a data model that is in keeping with that vision. First, so you start with your data and figure out what it is. You know, you can sort of go both ways, I guess, depending on whether you're inheriting data or starting from scratch. But that intellectual justification is the key. It's extremely, extremely important, for sure.
Think about this question also from the perspective of something that Doug brought up, which is that we're using images as primary resources now, and do we actually know what that means? And the image metadata relationship is always somehow they're tethered together differently in different databases and projects, right? And so trying to think about the facsimile, the images as themselves data, as resources, and the relationship to the material object, thinking also about Alberto's talk, is something that I think we're just beginning to teach and get better at explicating in the projects itself, because there's just an assumption because of longstanding cataloging practices about the relationship between the facsimile and the original, but we need to think more about it.
And you see this in IIIF, where because IIIF is a totally open access standard, that everyone who uses it builds the data into their manifest in a slightly different way, right? So when you open up a IIIF image and you open up a little side information panel, you're going to get different data depending on the institution, right? And that is that's what happens when you have something that's totally open source, where you can just take it and do what you want with it. But there are best practices that are laid out that, we would like everyone to be consistent. We would like to see shelf marks, for example, in there. That would be handy. Sorry, go ahead, Doug.
I would argue that is in part because of what IIIF is. So IIIF is a presentation platform.
Mm-hmm.
And so it allows you to present different data in different ways as you wish. We actually had a meeting a few years back at Penn where I realized that IIIF is not a metadata transfer platform. It's not intended as a way of communicating metadata between systems. It's a way of presenting images and then attaching annotations to those images. And in fact,
they just sort of come along for the ride.
They do. And so you can attach whatever, and you're actually not even attaching metadata to the images. It's the IIIF is a part of the shared canvas concept where there's a canvas. The image itself is a annotation, and the other things that are stuck on that two-dimensional space are also annotations. And so, and I think this goes to the question of like understanding what understanding the ontology, the epistemology of the system that you're working with and what its model is. And I think that this is one of the things that has worked about the Schoenberg database is this direct connection between the model and the workflow and this kind of this epistemological way of thinking about the data. And I think too, it's something that goes on in the VisCol project that people may be less familiar with, that Dot and Alberto, the model that they designed is very carefully thought out. How is it that you create a computational structure that describes the collation of a manuscript? What is the relationship between quires, between gatherings and leaves? And how can you model that so those two things fit together? And one of the things that we're working on now on the modeler implementation is how do you get those two things to work together so that it's clear to users that those two things they communicate each other, that they talk to one another in a way that's comprehensible to users.
VisCol I've found to be so useful in my own work of doing digital reconstructions, because I can use VisCol to actually show the original quire structure for a manuscript that doesn't exist anymore. So I'm sort of recreating this ghost of the manuscript that used to exist and the structure that used to exist that doesn't anymore. And that's an incredibly powerful thing to be able to do, visualizing, putting these dismembered bifolia back together and then putting the bifolia back into their quires. It's really, it's such an extraordinary way to be able to see that happen. And it's such a flexible model that it allows you to do that kind of work without limitation.
But what it is very clear, right? Like it fills a very specific space. And my feeling is that we're not there with images, like thinking about images as primary sources. There's still this muddy area where we equate the image with the book, and it isn't. Yeah. It has its own. It does a lot of things that the book can't possibly do, just as the same as the book does things that the image can't do. But we haven't really reckoned with that, and I don't think that the ways that we access it really essentially fit that model of an interface with the object that you're dealing with. It helps you understand what it is and reinforces it.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. And when we started, either this morning or when we started the session, Lynn said that we were going to have questions for the videos, the lightning talk videos. So I don't think that every person who has a lightning talk is here today, but if anybody has a question that you want to direct towards one of them, if you can type it in the field or raise your hand, and if the person is here, then they can answer it. Or if you just want to praise them.
Questions, but I just want to commend all of you who submitted videos. They're really spectacular, and if you haven't had a chance to see them, take some time. You don't have to watch them all in one sitting, obviously, but if you have some time and can dip in and out, they're really fantastic. There's such amazing work going on out there. It's really, really fantastic stuff.
Yeah.
There were two videos. One, Melissa Conway's video, where she talked about how actually being under lockdown forced her to look at all the manuscripts, whereas if she had gone on her research trip to Italy, she would have looked at only the most beautiful ones. I thought that point has been rattling in my brain since I heard it last night. And another one, they were all fabulous, but another one that's really struck me was Beth Fisher's work on using gold and metallic inks and reproducing a 3D model of the manuscript that then turns, that you can use different qualities of light to show how the gold would have been reflective under kind of movement, which you can't do, of course, with a static flat facsimile, going to some of the conversation we were just having. So I just wanted to say I really appreciated all the videos and some of the points that are sticking with me.
And if we don't get to questions today, we've got 2 more days and a coffee wine hour to talk about the videos and anything else that comes up. So yeah, please, if you want to record your questions in the chat, we can download those and keep them as part of the record if we can't get to them.
Okay,
Let's see.
We have 2 minutes.
Sorry, got caught up listening to what's going on in the background and somebody's.
Sorry, I think that's my son and my husband. I'll mute myself, Lynn, and I'll just turn it over to you.
That's fine. Tell them I said hi. Yeah, so I think we are pretty close to end of time. I think this has been a really successful first day. I thank everyone who's come for their interest, their participation. I especially thank our speakers today. You've done an excellent job of getting this started and starting lots of important conversations that I think are gonna, help us move forward, push the needle forward.
Thank you so much, Lynn.
My pleasure. All right.
Whitney.
Well, sorry.
I'm just thanking my fellow panelists.
Well, we can all take ourselves out for drinks in our kitchen. And remember what it was like to be together. But until then, I wish you all a good evening and see you tomorrow. We start at 10:30 Eastern time, 3:30 UK time, 4:30 Central European time. And my Time Buddy app says 2 a.m. if you're in Canberra, which I think at least one of our attendees is coming from Australia. So we won't expect to see her there. But hopefully those of you in Australia and other further away time zones will be able to join us for the discussion session. And I will try to get the videos posted as soon as possible. All right, well, see you tomorrow then.
See you
Thank
tomorrow.
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.